Neuhoff would find himself in Batavia, Jakarta, for a number of years, where he also worked as a merchant, a trader, a functionary of the East Indies Company now, again serving the interests, the economic, political interests of his mother country, Holland. And when he arrives to Java, he finds the same. He finds Asian societies that are extremely complex, diverse, ethnically, culturally, religiously. And on the one hand, that propensity to document, to report, to capture for the sake of knowledge is still there. So he documents everything that he sees. He documents the types of fishes you have around Java. He documents the type of fruits that you have, from the rambutan to the durian. I'm not sure whether he ate any durian, but he documented the durian, even had pictures of the durian inside the book. And he documents the different ethnic groups that he finds in Java around Batavia at the time. Next. And what we see then in the depiction of society in Java, again, is the kind of multiculturalism that he encounters in South America, in Brazil. But again, it's a kind of multiculturalism which is on the one hand natural, because Javan society is complex. It's not simply Javanese, it's all the other ethnic groups. But it's also a complexity that he, as a colonial merchant and as a colonial administrator, has to manage. Because this diversity on its own has, for him, no intrinsic worth. There's no point having a diverse society unless you can use it. So what happens? In Neuhoff's writing, and this is something that will be set in motion and it will continue for the next 250 years in Southeast Asia, with the coming of other Western colonial powers, Britain, France, and what have you, is a systematic attempt not only to understand the differences, but to find ways and means through which these differences can be managed, regulated, and perhaps even put to use. Because the society that eventually emerges in Batavia, what we now call Jakarta, was one that was segregated not only ethnically, but where ethnic differences coincided with economic functions and even your literal physical positionality. For those of you, I know all of us have been to Jakarta, Kota Lama eventually becomes the enclave of Europeans and the Dutch, and certain ethnic groups, while others were kept outside its walls. So we already begin to see the racialization of geography in the same way that this is what Neuhoff sees in Brazil. Plantations are for certain races. Towns are for certain races. Fortresses, forts, ports. Everyone has a place, a position to be slotted in like a jigsaw puzzle. And the myriad of societies that he encounters in Southeast Asia, including the fictional ones that I mentioned earlier, is actually interesting because he documents all of them. And actually, Neuhoff's book, for political historians like myself, is hugely interesting because he doesn't simply list the different communities. He actually describes in very precise, objective terms what their functions were then under Dutch rule in Batavia. So next. And so you have these, some would say charming, of course, I admit they are Orientalists, but I find them charming anyway. You have these images, early attempts at trying to depict different ethnic groups that are found not only in Java, but across maritime Southeast Asia. Next. This is someone from Timor, the warrior from Timor. Next. These are Javanese in Batavia. Next. These are also people in Batavia. Makassaris, if I'm not mistaken, in Batavia. Next. These are Malays in Batavia. Smoking cigarettes, by the way. So, I identify with them the most. Next. Now this, I'll get back to this later on, because for me, this is perhaps one of the most interesting images that have emerged in the 17th century. I'll tell you why later on. But I just want to draw your attention to some of the images that we've just seen. Can we go back? Okay, back. Okay, so these are urban dwellers seen through the lens of Neuhoff at the time, as he documents the different communities living inside the fort of Batavia and around the fort of Batavia. And then we go back, and we go back. Okay. And here you have the famous Timorese, who, of course, if you pay close attention, of course, is living way outside Java, beyond Dutch control. And there is a ranking that we see, not only in his written descriptions of the societies, but also in the images that accompany his text. So the further you are from the centers of colonial capital, the more savage you become. So we have images of warrior races performing all kinds of barbaric hobbies. There you have his children playing with someone's head on the floor. But if you look at the other images, looking at the communities living closer to the center of commerce, colonial commerce, the implication is that commerce brings with it civilization. And we see this theme is also repeated in his depiction of life in Brazil. So those who are further from the centers of colonial capital are the ones who are more barbaric and savage and what have you. So this is the beginnings of modern Orientalism and how it's introduced through colonial scholarship. Let's go forward, next. And this is interesting because this is one community that Neuhoff talks about. These are the famous Mardicas. For those who are not familiar with the term Mardicas, it's this derivative from the word merdeka, which means a free man, an independent man. So the Mardicas are basically often Eurasians who were the only other community allowed to live inside the fort of Batavia, along with the Europeans, because they're half white and many of them had converted as well. And so they wear with them the trappings of, that's hence the European dress, and if you look at the house in the background, it's a European house. It's really interesting when we look at Neuhoff's work, how Brazil and Java are not simply left as Brazil and Java. Brazil and Java have to be interpreted. You have to read Brazil and Java. And in the process of interpreting Brazil and Java comes the classification, the hierarchies, the social hierarchies that are constructed, in Neuhoff's writing. And this is, of course, the dilemma that many of us in academia face, because we are acutely aware of the fact that writing about the thing makes the thing as well. Neuhoff, of course, is a 17th century man, so he's not plagued by wokeness or political correctness. He doesn't mind that he's actually inventing the object as he goes along, and he is doing that. He makes that very clear in his text. There's a refreshing honesty to the way in which he doesn't hide the fact that he's there to make money, that he's working for a colonial company, and for him, that's good. That's good that we are doing this. So we're ordering society and we're introducing these hierarchies of race, class, and function in the process of knowing Java. So to know Java and to know Brazil is not simply to know Brazil or to know Java, it's to control it. Knowledge is power. So next. And of course, you'll notice that in Neuhoff's book, the images, Neuhoff, by the way, of course, didn't make the images. The images are made by artists who followed Neuhoff's directions. But if you look at the images that accompany his work on Java and the images that accompany his work on Brazil, one community is left out. You see everyone else. You see Africans, you see Asians, you see Bataks, you see Sundanese, you see Makasaris, you see Timorese, you see Malays. But there's one community that you don't see, and you never see it. It's the European. Because it's the European who sees and is not seen. It's the European who sees. So what do we see? We don't see Europeans, but we see the products of European intervention. You see the buildings. You see the buildings and you see testimonies, concrete, literally concrete and stone testimonies to economic success. And that's the driving thing. That's the thing that drives Neuhoff in his search for knowledge and his desire to come to know these different parts of the world. Why do we need to read this book today? Like I said, it's largely forgotten. And it's interesting because perhaps Neuhoff's writing on Brazil might be known in Brazil, but not known here in Java. and is writing on Java, might be known in Java, but perhaps not in Brazil. This Churchill edition connects the two, and that makes it interesting for me because it's easy to compare and to see the continuities. But for me, there are a number of things that we can learn from this process. And I confess that I'm a boring historian. I have no social life. I don't go on social media. So this is all I do. I read old books. So while reading these works, what I find interesting is how, in the process of actually re-encountering these early encounters, we see the way in which different parts of the world were actually brought into the order of universal knowledge. How Brazil becomes part of the world community, how Java becomes part of the world community, because the world community is then driven by commerce. So this is knowledge in the age of the first globalization, first instance of globalization. But the reason why I think we today need to go back to this is because there's a lot that we find in the writings of Neuhoff, but there's also a lot that's not written in the writings of Neuhoff, and we need to learn how to read the unwritten. What's not written in the writings of Neuhoff, like these images that we see, where you see everyone, but you don't see the person writing the book. What you don't see in Neuhoff, well, what's not explicit in Neuhoff, is how Java and Brazil are really the products of a certain mindset that constructs them in a certain way. And I think for so long, we in the South have only come to know one another via reference through the North. I mean, it's, you know, in my own academic background, when I studied about Asia, where did I study about Asia? I studied about Asia in London. I had to go to SOAS to study about Thailand, which, when you think about it, is absurd. You know, it's truly absurd. The fact that I have to go to SOAS to study about Thailand is, I think, something that does not make sense. But that's the legacy that we're talking about. That's the legacy that has been alluded to earlier. And the legacy begins here. It begins in the 17th century. It's a long historical process that has gone on for more than 300 years, where the world as we know it has been brought to our attention through a certain regime of knowledge. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not one of these who would simply dismiss all Western knowledge because it's Western. I think that's absurd. But what I'm trying to say is that there are also other ways that we can come to learn and know one another. And I think the timing of our rereading of this text today is important, because it comes at a time, particularly now, today, this week, where, as Parekh mentioned earlier, our earlier understanding of the world order is changing very rapidly. Indonesia's entry into BRICS, I think, marks a very significant step in the path of South-South cooperation, where countries in the South can perhaps get to know one another without looking at each other through imported lens, but rather to get to know one another directly. I think this is something long overdue. I still cannot for the life of me understand why my students in Southeast Asia, and I've taught practically across the whole of Southeast Asia by now, I don't understand why our students in Southeast Asia can know so much about the American Revolution, but not know the history of their neighboring country, or not know the history of South America. I think it is shameful that in this day and age, in 2025, so many universities and institutions of higher learning in Southeast Asia do not have centers or departments of schools of African studies and South American studies. And I think it goes the other way around as well. I think it's a tragedy that in my contact, because I have had South American students as well, many of my South American students have told me that they know actually nothing about Southeast Asia, except Bali, of course. Everybody knows Bali, right? So Bali is the focal point, yeah? And I always tell my students, that was a Freudian slip. I always tell my students, surfing in Bali is not research. Yeah, it's not research. So I think we need to take this opportunity to actually genuinely build new bodies of knowledge that do not necessarily refute or deny or negate or erase other earlier legacies. I'm not the person who will say that, stop reading Neuhoff. I want us to read Neuhoff. I want us to read Neuhoff because I want us to understand what got us here in the first place. But now is the time, now's the opportunity for Indonesian universities to embrace our colleagues and friends, not only in Southeast Asia, but in South Asia, in Africa, in South America, and vice versa. So I think because of that, Neuhoff, I think, becomes timely. It's timely because sometimes in academic work, you need to know what to do, but you also need to know what not to do. You need counterexamples. And Neuhoff's not wrong. He's not wrong in what he writes, but it's just one way of looking at the world, and I think there are many others. And this, I think, is what we see in the writings of Neuhoff, this development of a monological way of, a singular way of just looking at the world through one lens. And that's the lens of, Western colonialism at the time. I agree that we should not deny our legacy, but we are not trapped by our legacy either. We are not beholden to it forever. And perhaps, I hope, as Pak Rector mentioned earlier, we can take opportunities like this to build actual, working bonds, learning bonds in our societies. One last thing before I end. Like I said, the interesting thing about these books is that they also point out, certain things which even we have forgotten. So can I just go back a few images? I want to go back to one image in particular. Earlier? Okay, stop. Now, this for me is one of the most interesting images in Neuhoff's book. This comes in the original. Yeah, the Churchill images are exactly the same plates as the Neuhoff originals. Any guesses as to what this is? This is a family in Batavia. Any guesses as to who these people might be? We saw Malays, Sundanese, Makassiris, Timorese just now. Any guesses? No. These are Africans. These are Africans in Batavia. And there's a paragraph in his book, because like I said, whatever we say about Neuhoff, he recorded things objectively. And Neuhoff made a very important observation. And he said that at this time of writing, 1682, the fruit markets of Batavia were dominated by Africans. And this may well be one of the first images of Africans in Southeast Asia. Yeah, I don't know of any image older than this one, right? So I'm particularly attracted to this image, that Africans had settled in Batavia. And Africans were dominating the fruit market in Batavia at that time. Yeah, so the fruit markets around Batavia are all dominated by African families. Now, who are these Africans? Probably former slaves, perhaps sailors on Dutch ships, because we know there's also been a history of Africans in Java during the Java War, 1825 to 1830, when the Dutch found that they did not know how to fight the Javanese because they were not used to this guerrilla warfare. What do the Dutch do? They bring from the Gold Coast Africans from their colonies to Java to fight the Java War. And this community was then called the Belanda Hitam, the Black Dutchmen. Yeah. Now, there is so much still under-researched here. And as Ambassador Prata pointed out earlier, there are so many connections, some of them natural, some unnatural, some engineered, some necessary, some purely accidental, but so many of these connections, I think, deserve closer investigation and closer reading. And for that reason, that's why I don't despair when I read Neuhoff, because there's a lot in there that still deserves, I think, thorough research. And in particular, this connection between Java and Brazil that was engineered as a result of the rise of the BOC and the Dutch East Indies Company and the Dutch West Indies Company. It's an accidental marriage. Yeah? They didn't meet, it's an accidental marriage that is engineered by the ambitions of a colonial company. But as a result of that, two different parts of the world connected. And that connection sadly has been forgotten after World War II, because we've all been swept by the wave of our own nationalisms, and it's us, it's me, I. So, modern nationalism is just like millennials. It's just about me all the time. And what we forget are these transnational connections that once bound the whole world together, including Europe. I think now is a time when we are looking at this, what's going on in the world today. Now is a good time for us to somehow go back to this and to ask questions and do our research and perhaps attempt to strike new ground, open up new ground for research and collaboration, where I hope the day will come where Java and Brazil and Java will actually get to know one another face to face, directly, and not through a dating app. And perhaps, that's long overdue, but I think that's long overdue for Asia and Africa and South America as well. So with that as my last observation, once again, thank you very much. I know I apologize for being a historian. We are boring. We can't help it. It's in our genes. But I hope that you found some of this interesting, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
If you allow me, first of all, Professor, I'd like to thank you for a very insightful and comprehensive presentation. And I think that the most important point of it is that we have to know each other better directly. Reading this wonderful book, we learn a lot, but we learned, as you said, through the eyes of someone else. And I think that now it's time for us to speak directly to each other. And also, before I go on, I'd like to welcome my good colleague, the Ambassador of Portugal. And as I have said in my presentation, I was born in a city whose name had its origin in a Dutch fort, but I'm very much a Lusophone, and and much of the Brazilian what we have of Brazilian culture, we had it through the lenses of the Portuguese, and now going back to the book, I think that there's so many things to discuss about this book. First of all, I think that we realize that globalization started a long time ago. It's nothing new. There's nothing new about it. Sometimes we forget how diverse our world was, and above all, sometimes we forget how we were subject to the different tides of history. As you said, whatever was happening in Europe had a huge influence in our lives or in our history. And then, by the way, I don't know if you're aware of the reason why you see the Dutch went to Brazil. The Dutch went to Brazil due to wars in Europe. There was a time when Portugal and Spain were a single country, and Spain was at war with Holland, with the Netherlands, and so the Dutch found a very good excuse to go to Brazil, although what they were looking was for trade, for wealth. Basically, in the case of northeastern Brazil, they're looking for the sugarcane plantations. And as you said, they had capital, they had know-how, and they were fairly successful for a while. But it's also interesting to mention that it was they brought from them, again due to European circumstances, a very diverse group of people, traders, of course, to start with, but also scientists, artists, a lot of Jews. The first synagogue in the Americas was founded in Recife by the Dutch. So diversity is something that we had within us, but it was enriched by our history. The other point that I'd like to call your attention is that as much as it is important for us to understand our past and to draw lessons from it, our past does not determine who we are today. And this is the reason why, as you mentioned, we have to look at each other directly. We have much to do together. And I think, as I mentioned also in my initial words, Brazil and Indonesia can have a lot of common interests, and we can do a lot of things together. And we are important representatives of the Global South and the discussions that are shaping our world today. That's it. Thank you, Professor.